Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for coming on a cold evening at the Christmas party time of year. And apologies for making it late and cold. But hopefully we'll keep you entertained. As Sarah said, I'll be talking for about 20 minutes or so. I'll be presenting this report, copies of which are outside, so do pick them up. And further copies of which do ask for if you need them, and it's free on the web, so do send it to people, and do read it. So the quote up on the front is the sort of starting point for the report. It's a reflection on sort of where we've got to in humanitarian action in fulfilling the primary role of the state to protect and assist its own citizens in times of disasters. That's clearly recognised in statements of principle. This UN resolution, I'm throwing my pen around, being the sort of one of the fundamental ones. But the argument of the report is that it's been too often neglected by international aid agencies in practice. That the aid agencies have neglected the central role of the state. And also the flip side of that states have too often neglected their own responsibilities to assist and protect their own citizens. But as the title of the meeting here today suggests, there are some hopeful signs of progress, both in terms of states' willingness to accept their own responsibilities and international aid's efforts to support them to do that. So we'll be reflecting on some of those today. And we've also sort of put a bit of a link to the 5-year anniversary of the tsunami in this meeting today, in the sense that it's an opportune moment to reflect on where we've got to in terms of the state's role in responding to its own disasters. The tsunami response saw both criticism of international aid for undermining national capacities, much of it valid, but also, of course, a strong leadership role played by some countries in responding to the tsunami. India largely declined international assistance and led its own response, as did Thailand. So you saw both sides of this argument. And since then, there's been much that's happened. I'm just back. I got back on Thursday from a trip to Indonesia where I was looking at the Padang earthquake response. And I'll talk a bit about that later. But you can see the sort of trajectory of how the state is responding to disasters in Indonesia in interesting ways. I'll come back to that. So the report was a 2-year research process with a series of case studies. Some of those case studies I think are outside if you want to pick those up, and they're also available on the web. During the 2-year process, I left ODI and joined Humanitarian Outcomes, and my wife had a baby, so it was a sort of interrupted research process from my point of view. And the case studies were done by other people because I didn't want to be travelling, so thanks are due to other people. And as well as the case studies, it was based on a comprehensive literature review, and the report and briefing paper are the end process of that. When I started the work, I had sort of 3 basic hypotheses, one of which I've talked about, that international aid actors have tended to neglect the role of the state. The starting point for it really came when I was sat in yet another meeting about good humanitarian donorship, and we were going around in circles on good humanitarian donorship principles. And I started thinking, well, this is all very well and right and proper that there should be good humanitarian donorship principles. But it's slightly back to front. We have donorship principles without the principles of good humanitarian governance that should underpin how we do things. And we have a whole set of sort of, as well as good humanitarian ownership, a whole set of principles and guidelines and sphere and so on that regulates the wrong word, that help international aid agencies to think about how they should do their business better. But there aren't the primary role of the state is neglected in all of this, and is also remarkably absent from the literature. If you think about the growing literature on humanitarian aid, there's just much less about what states do, how they do it, how aid agencies relate to the state than there is about what aid agencies and donors do. And then the second hypothesis from my own experience was as an aid worker before I joined HPG, that if you could get many developing country government officials in an honest mood, they wouldn't be big fans of international humanitarian aid and international humanitarian aid agencies. They would often think that we are overpaid, disrespectful. They would be not sure about our motives. And so the relationship is in some sense dysfunctional. There's the two key actors involved in responding to humanitarian crises where international aid is involved, the government and the international aid actors, just don't get on very well together, and that's too often ignored. And you need to sort of acknowledge it as a problem before you can deal with it. And looking back and thinking about this, there's a tendency to assume that the current system is set in stone, the current way of responding to disasters. And the current way, but by current way, I mean when there is international aid assistance, it's largely bypass the state's perhaps the wrong word, but it's a sort of international system where you have caps, you have flash appeals, where donors fund international aid agencies who then respond to disasters with direct delivery. Now, they cooperate with the state. If you're Merlin, you work with the Ministry of Health. If you're SAVE, you work with the Ministry of Education. That doesn't mean the state's completely ignored, but money and action flows to some extent from donor governments through international aid agencies. But this is what's become to be the case in the 90s and the 2000s, but it's actually an odd historical moment. If you look back in the 70s and 80s in disaster response, states played a much more central role. If you look, for instance, at the response to drought in Southern Africa in the 1980s, that was largely bilateral. Donor governments funded Southern African governments with balance of payment support, and they imported more food aid and then distributed it themselves. So there's just sort of started to be a different way of doing things. The contrast, for instance, is with Malawi in 2000, 2001, when I was working for Concern Worldwide, and the international response to the food crisis there was entirely international. USAID largely funded WFP, who funded international NGOs to deliver food. And the thought of that going through the government not only didn't happen, it wasn't even on the agenda. It was sort of wasn't considered as an option. So the whole financing system, the whole thrust of humanitarian reform, SURF, clusters, have focused on reforming the international system, on adjusting how aid flows from donor governments to international aid agencies, rather than the more fundamental look at the role of the state. The starting point, clearly, for thinking about the role of the state should be principles. But what the core humanitarian principles mean for how you relate to the state is oddly underanalyzed. Independence and debates about independence within the literature, and indeed if you look at how independence is defined in the Code of Conduct in SPEAR, is about how aid agencies relate to their donor governments and the need to be independent from your donors. And what independence means for how you relate to the state and the country where a disaster is taking place just doesn't appear. And in practice, if you look at how principles are used, aid workers often tend to cite neutrality and independence as sort of shorthand for keeping the state at arm's length, as reasons for wanting to be careful about how they relate to the state. As the Red Cross quote here goes, this is Pictet, the second bullet point, and the third. The Red Cross has certainly always seen independence as compatible with working with the state, that national societies can be both sort of auxiliaries to government and independent. And it's that balance that Pictet talks about. He talks about the need for a proper balance between independence and the auxiliary role of the Red Cross. And that's the sort of aspect of independence that I think has been neglected in sort of analysis in the literature. And and that what the principles imply isn't disengagement from the state, but a need for principled engagement with the state in how you operate and in encouraging it to fulfil its primary responsibility. And we argue there's a need for more discussion and analysis of this, that independence needs to be unpicked, and what independence means for how you operate in practice needs to be looked at in more detail. There's also a need, I think, to think, and we argue in the report, to think more carefully about how humanitarian principles relate to development ones. If you're DFID, in many disasters, particularly protracted crises, in theory, you've made simultaneous commitments to humanitarian principles through your good humanitarian donorship, respecting agencies, neutrality and independence. You're committed to the Paris principles of alignment, ownership and harmonisation, and you've committed to the fragile states principles of state building as a central objective. And there's just been very little thought or analysis about whether those are complementary or contradictory, whether as a donor or as an agency you can be simultaneously committed to those, whether you should be trying to be. So we argue firstly that there's a need for more thinking about that, that in places like Sri Lanka, Pakistan or Zimbabwe, you need to think about how and whether you can be simultaneously committed to state building, ownership and independence. But actually we argue in the report that they're not, there's certainly tensions between them, but that they're not completely contradictory. That humanitarian actors, particularly international aid agencies, could usefully focus more on development principles, could usefully think about how they should be more aligned to government objectives, more respectful of the need for government to take ownership and responsibility to assist its own citizens in times of disaster. But that equally development actors could usefully be more humanitarian, that they should think about how they need to be neutral, independent and impartial in protracted crises and conflicts. And again, that these are arguments for sort of principled engagement with states in ways that respect both development and humanitarian principles. The literature, such as it is on the role of the state, has tended to focus on sort of the critique of international aid as undermining government capacity, and you see this in many evaluations, the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition being one of them, where there is sort of trenchant criticism of the tendency of the international system to do various negative things, which are listed here. Inappropriately substitute, sort of overwhelm government by a sudden influx of aid agencies, just be sort of insufficiently respectful of the sovereign role of government. All of these are certainly concerns, and they have been rightly identified in a series of evaluations and analyses. But there's a tendency for this to be a bit simplistic, we argue, that humanitarian aid often makes a sort of easy target, and the criticism can be sort of somewhat knee-jerk, that you need to balance recognition of the sort of failings of the international system to work with and build national capacities with a recognition of real efforts that are being made to build and work with national capacities in all sorts of places. There's lots of genuine good efforts that international aid agencies make to work with governments at different levels, both within line ministries and with central government disaster management authorities. And there's certainly more going on than I managed to get at in the report. As I sort of just come back from Indonesia, I realised there was sort of far more going on there than I was able to get at. And so the sort of stereotype of international aid agencies rushing in as a sort of bunch of insensitive cowboys and trampling over national capacities just isn't particularly true or helpful. And so you need to sort of get away from that stereotype as a starting point for this debate. And then the second point, the more particularly important argument around this is whether humanitarian action undermines the political contract between a state and its citizens, whether in the absence of humanitarian aid, states would be better responding to disasters and protecting and assisting their own citizens. And that's the sort of Duval argument in Famine Crimes and I'm forgetting the other classic book from the 80s and 90s. But I mean, we argue to some extent this is a sort of unknowable counterfactual. If all the aid agencies left, we don't know whether states would suddenly become more responsible. But it seems unlikely. The nastiness of some governments and the weakness of others makes it unlikely that if all agencies suddenly left, they'd suddenly become more concerned for the welfare of their own citizens. And the humanitarian imperative, anyway, means that it would be wrong to try and find out. As a quick change of gear, I was going to talk to you about Indonesia before coming back to sort of conclusions. What we were doing was a piece of work for the Australian government looking at coordination issues and the role of OCHA in the Asia-Pacific region. And what I was focused on was the recent response to the Padang earthquake. Now, there's been lots of important progress since the tsunami, not least in terms of legislation, which David will be talking about more in general. Indonesia's passed a new disaster management law, and there's a sort of renewed government commitment to taking how it responds to disasters seriously. The Padang earthquake happened at a sort of inconvenient time in the rollout of the new disaster management authority. It's starting to have capacity at a national level, but not really yet at a province and a district level. But the international system is certainly making efforts to support that renewed government commitment to responding to disasters. OCHA is working closely with the BNBP, which is the Disaster Management Authority at national level. There's contingency planning processes. There's all sorts of things going on. And is investing in preparedness and capacity building. But in the Padang response, you see the sort of that although that takes place outside of emergencies, there's a tendency for the international system to sort of to revert to type in when the pressure's on. So the Padang response was turned into a big aid agency influx. There were 200 plus international NGOs. There were 23 search and rescue organisations, over 700 people. And when that happens, just the sort of the force of numbers means that the international system starts sort of talking to itself. So coordination meetings, for instance, started taking place in English just because of the number of people there. So government stopped attending. And so you started having two parallel coordination systems. Government was playing an important role in response. It was the ones that were providing food aid and cash daily allowances to people. So it was certainly responding to its own disaster. So government had its own coordination meetings going on to talk about what it was doing. The international system had its own coordination system going on to talk about what they were doing. And the two barely interacted. And then there's also a big contrast with the earthquake in West Java, which happened a few weeks before the one in West Sumatra, where it was a smaller earthquake, but it was still a significant earthquake with many people displaced, many people having lost their homes. But there was vanishingly little international aid response, partly because the government had a less clear signal that it was going to welcome international assistance, so donors didn't provide funding and people didn't respond. So from the Indonesian government's point of view, there's a problem with the sort of appeal process. Firstly, the word itself. They don't like the idea of having to appeal. It's seen as the meaning. But secondly, with a sort of feast or famine problem. You either appeal and you get an influx of hundreds of aid agencies and the problems that creates, or you don't appeal and nothing happens and there's very little international aid response. And there are particular issues around, if you think about how the system's doing in terms of, based on Padang, in terms of sort of supporting national ownership, national capacities, alignment with governments. Language issues are critical. The fact of coordination meetings taking place in English sounds mundane, but actually the ability of the international system to be more respectful of government authority and sovereignty has to start with speaking the same language. And so there's a need for sort of translation surge as well as other types of surge. And one of the more general findings from the report, for instance, was that in Latin America, there is a tendency for sort of more constructive, respectful relations between international aid agencies and governments. And I think that's partly just a language issue, that all the expatriates working in Latin America speak Spanish, and Spanish is the lingua franca, and so there is a common language in ways that doesn't apply in Africa and Asia always. I think there's an issue with what I was just talking about, with the sort of nuanced appeals that David also talks about in the IDRL reports. The West Sumatra response, I think, probably had too many aid agencies, international aid agencies. And this is a common problem. You saw it also in the tsunami response to high-profile emergencies. The problem is the opposite in neglected emergencies. But in high-profile ones, if there are too many agencies, the question then becomes sort of what, if anything, can anyone do about it? And I think responsibility has to rest with governments, with the affected state governments. And it's interesting to think about what they could do. They could pre-register aid agencies, either those who already have capacity in the country and are working there, or those who could have something additional to offer that they've identified. And they could welcome international assistance of those agencies and not let in anyone else. And that's controversial. It would be problematic if you had governments inappropriately restricting who came in and who didn't in ways that were sort of negative for the welfare of citizens. But I think that sort of debate needs to start to happen, or governments will start doing it anyway, and then we'll sort of lose the terms of the debate. Donors, I think, also have responsibilities to think about this, and to think about, I mean, there's a particular search and rescue problem with donor governments just sending in far too many search and rescue teams in a way that created chaos and didn't do very much good. But beyond that, I think a responsibility to signal more clearly that they'll only be funding agencies with established capacity, and to think about what that means in particular countries. And aid agencies also have responsibilities. There's a great tendency of aid agencies to rush in and not to think about when they shouldn't be somewhere. And that's the sort of the grown-up responsibility of agencies to make decisions not to respond to some emergencies is rarer than it should be. You did see it, for instance, in the tsunami response with MSF, who quickly decided to sort of stop raising money and to not do it, but they were the sort of exception rather than the rule. Conclusions. Coming back from Indonesia, sorry, I'm just organising my notes. I mean, in the report, we argue that whether we like it or not, the odd historical moment of the 90s and 2000s when the state was relatively absent from the sort of international humanitarian aid debate has gone. We're going to have stronger, more assertive states asserting greater control over disasters in their own countries, whether we as international aid actors like it or not. And we probably will like it in some countries and won't like it in others. It'll have negative consequences in countries where governments are nasty, corrupt, or very weak. And you're starting to see that in the expulsion of agencies from Sudan, in the problems this year with humanitarian aid in Sri Lanka in terms of access. And you're also starting to see it in positive terms in other countries where states are responding more effectively to the needs and priorities of their own citizens, and that's got to be a good thing. But it's going to happen, and we need to think about, as international aid actors, how we respond to that. Part of that, if you look at most definitions of disasters, they start with a clause about national capacities being overwhelmed. And what that implies, of course, is a need on the part of aid agencies deciding whether and how to respond, to assess, if you want to know whether there's a disaster or not, you need to assess whether or not national capacities have been overwhelmed. And aid agencies rarely do this properly. We need to think about more about how you assess capacities and the extent to which they've been overwhelmed in assessment processes. And then there's a whole set of implications for how international aid agencies do business. There's still very much focus on international aid agencies delivering stuff and thinking about how they, as organisations, get better at doing that more quickly and effectively. And and there's a need, I think, as states become more assertive and as aid agencies think about how to respect the primary role of the state better, to think about what that means for what they do and to shift from a focus on delivery to a focus on supporting states and thinking about ways in which they do that, or covering gaps or advocating for gaps in state responses. And also what I've just talked about, I need to think about the appeal process and how to get away from the sort of the either-or situation that the Indonesian government finds itself in. Either you get a sort of massive influx or you don't get anything. And for donor governments, there's a need to think about how they fund disaster response. Again, it's a sort of odd situation where donors trust governments enough to give them budget support for long-term development, but don't trust them enough to fund them directly to respond to their own disasters. So you have countries like Mozambique, where you've got long-term budget support arrangements, but the response to disasters is still through flash appeals, which go through the UN to international aid agencies. And this is clearly, in some fundamental senses, about trust. Donor governments don't trust developing country governments to respond to their own disasters. But the system sort of risks getting set in stone. You just reach an impasse where, because there isn't trust, you don't fund governments, and because you don't fund governments, that trust can't be built. And so there's a need to think about how you could, as donors, directly fund national disaster management authorities and what that would entail and how trust could be built up over time to do that. And that'll be more of an issue in some countries than others. In places like Indonesia, frankly, the Indonesian government increasingly won't need international assistance to do that. But in other countries, the funding could be important. And often systems just aren't in place. In Indonesia, for instance, in the response to the Padang earthquake, AusAid did want to give 300 grand to the National Disaster Management Authority, the NBP. But after trying to figure out how to do it for about 3 or 4 months, have just given up because the systems just weren't in place to transfer the funds. So that sort of needs to be part of contingency and preparedness planning. And then finally, obviously, the growing importance and assertiveness of states doesn't mean that international aid agencies won't be needed. Their role might be different. And certainly in all sorts of conflicts and protracted crises, there is still a very obvious and fundamental role for principled, independent, neutral international humanitarian action. And arguably, of course, doing better at getting states to respond and protect and assist their own citizens where they have the capacity to do so, and in particular to natural disasters, would leave international humanitarian action able to focus on where it's most needed, in exactly the conflicts and places like DRC and Zimbabwe and Sudan, where Somalia, where the needs are greatest and where international humanitarian aid is most needed. That's it. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to David.
Thank you, Paul.